Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Clint Stone, Chapter 22, Marooned, written by some guy named Ted. Note, this is 1 week behind the TEDx storyline. First thing Dewar noticed was the smell, heavy and cloying. It was a rich, sickly sweet smell of rot. The second thing he noticed was that he was alive. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on his back, looking up at the ceiling of the ship. It looked strange for some reason, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He blinked, and it came into focus. There was blood and other bodily fluid splattered across the surface, dried and peeling. Where had that come from? How much had he missed while unconscious? With a groan, Dewar forced himself into a sitting position, using his arms to steady himself. He glanced around and found that he was in the transport area of the ship and not in the cockpit, where he had been when the ship had gone to warp. And where was everyone else? Dewar could not see any trace of them. Was that them on the ceiling? No, there didn't seem to be enough for more than one being. He rolled over on his hands and knees, his head starting to spin, and Dewar paused, waiting for it to stop. When it did, he pushed himself up to his feet and stepped towards the door. He paused at the threshold, considering for a moment, and grabbed a spare rifle from the rack. It was always best to be armed in an unknown environment. Both the IPDM suits and comedian suit were intact and working condition, so he was ready to both fight and hide, whichever became necessary. Dewar stood in the airlock and took a deep breath, readying himself. Reaching out, he pressed the button that controlled the locking mechanism and stepped out into the blazing light. He blinked rapidly, trying to get his eyes used to the blinding light. After a few seconds, his eyes were greeted with the sight of a broad plain. It was covered in a sparse vegetation under a pale blue sky devoid of clouds. The first step he took onto the surface of the mysterious planet almost sent him to his knees, as the ground gave way beneath him like the sand, not the dirt had been expecting. Stupid! Dewar shouldn't expect anything. Fire burned, meat tasted good, and expectations got you killed. Regaining his balance, Dewar glanced around and saw a trail of footsteps leading to the back of the ship. As they were only the markings that he could see, it stood to reason that they were the footsteps of his team. Why they had left him behind was an interesting question. Had they just abandoned him, thinking him dead? Were they forced to flee quickly from some threat, and he left them behind because he would slow them down? The only way Dewar was going to get answers was if he followed the tracks. The sun beat down on his head, warming his hard skin. One thing was clear. This was not where they should have ended up. They had been aiming for Aloria, the barren moon. Instead, the ship had brought them to this grassy plain. Dewar was not even sure where this existence they were. With a miscalculated warp jump, they could have ended up on any other planet in the universe from where they were trying to go. Dewar supposed it was lucky that he survived at all. After the ship had been hit, the warp drive went crazy. The fact that the ship was still in one piece and was nothing short of a miracle. Usually, accidents involving warp jumps ended up with atoms and ships scattered across known space. But luck could only get you so far. The ship had crashed in an unknown world, his team was missing, and Dewar needed to find shelter from the damned heat. His species was not evolved for deserts and unrelenting sun. Rounding the back of the ship, he found his answers much sooner than he had expected. Resting in the cool shadow of the ship was his team, all 4 of them. He sighed with relief as he crossed into the shadow of the sun no longer beating down on his head. Vienna looked up at a prone position on the ground, her head cushioned into a bundle of cloth. Smiling, she pushed herself up. "Dewar, you're awake," she said, hurrying over to Dewar. Boy, Weiss, and Carol all glanced up at the mention of his name. Dewar nodded in their direction, and the only greeting he was going to give them. No sense in wasting energy talking when a nod would do. When Vienna got close, she reached up and lifted Dewar's eyelids. An unexpected touch and a sudden closeness caused Dewar to jerk his head back. knocking her hand to the side. He glared at her. She tusked. I'm just checking to see if you survived intact. You were unconscious for about a day. That can leave some permanent damage. Dewar sighed and nodded his consent. There was no point in arguing. Vienna was right, and she would get her way one way or another. Vienna gently lifted the eyelids and peered into his eye. He moved it as she directed, to the left, to the right, to the up and down. She muttered under her breath, too quiet for even him to hear. When he looked straight ahead, Dewar became uncomfortably aware of how close Vienna was standing. He could hear her low, smooth breathing, and her hand on his head was pleasantly cool. Watching Vienna as she examined his eyes, Dewar was slightly startled when she finished and locked gazes with him. Her eyes were soft blue, the color of a gently winding stream, the water that poured over the rocks. The blue seemed to beckon to him, drawing him ever closer. What was this? He blinked and stepped rapidly backwards, pulling himself out of the depths, and that had never happened to him before. Vienna chuckled. What? Never seen a girl's eyes? She teased with a strange lift in her voice. Dewar's mouth opened and almost of its own accord, before it shut with a click. Instead he glanced around at the makeshift camp, and not seeing what he was looking for, turning to Vienna and asked, Water? Vienna sighed. No water, I'm afraid. Whatever we had on board was spilled or evaporated in the crash, and, well, she gestured around. This place doesn't have any that we could find. We don't know that, said Krall, who had come up behind Vienna and was listening in on the conversation. Moroik just said it wasn't likely. Moroik. Who was that? The name sounded Swern, but it couldn't be because no Swern would help another species, let alone a group flying in a stolen Swern vessel. Dewar looked at Vienna and raised his brow, silently asking a question. Moroik is... She was interrupted by another voice, and unfamiliar to Dewar. I managed to find a few rise and Whoa! Dewar had leveled his rifle at the Swarm who had appeared behind the ship. He did not look like Dewar had expected. He was short and skinny, perhaps 5 feet tall. The Swarm was a far cry from the hulking warriors Dewar had fought before. He did not have a bearing of a soldier either. He had shied away from the gun, half turning his body, hands held above his head. It's fine, Moroik, Vienna said, reaching out and pushing barrel down towards the ground. Dewar was just surprised, that's all. She gave Dewar a sharp glare before turning back to the Swarm. Dewar felt his face cold in confusion. She was defending a Swarm. The Swarm slowly lowered his hands and paced Dewar. I apologize for startling you. Dewar, is it? Dewar fixed the Swarm in a hard stare, finally giving him a curt nod. Vienna seemed to trust him, and she was usually a good judge of character, so Dewar would tolerate the Swarm. But he would not trust him. He had trusted Swarm before. Rubbing his ribs absently, Dewar turned back to Vienna, who jerked his head towards the Swarm, eyebrow raised, asking the question silently. Vienna rolled her eyes and said, Moroik was making his way through this desert when our ship crashed in front of him. He managed to get the door open and he... To be fair, your ship didn't crash so much as appear out of thin air and land on the ground. The Swarm interrupted. Dewar focused his gaze on the Swarm and saw him slump a slightest bit. Wilter under Dewar's gaze. Dewar also noticed the Swarm's left tusk had been sawn off, having a rough stump an inch above his hip. Tusk removal was a rare punishment amongst the Swarm, denoting cowardice or dishonor. Dewar wondered which it was. For some reason, Vienna glared back at Dewar, shaking her head in the slightest amount. He found us unconscious in the wreck and he pulled us out, she continued. As it happens, Moroik is from the Swarm training camp some 100 miles to the south, sent out here as a punishment. He's like Kroort, Dewar. He hates the Empire just as much as we do, and he wants to join the rebellion. Dewar gave her a flat stare, signaling his disbelief. Whis called out from the back, You said you brought back some food, Moroik. That's right, said the Swarm. Some Rias. What are those? Asked Krall. And more importantly, do they taste good? The swarm swung his pack off his shoulder and walked to the center of the shade cast by the ship, surrounded by the bandits. Reaching inside, he pulled out a long, slim animal covered in fur. This is a ryu. Small mammals that spend their lives burrowing underground. They're pretty much the only food source in the wastes. And yes, they taste good, cooked right. This was met with happy exclamations from 3 of the new bandits. Dua caught Vienna's eyes and motioned to the side. She nodded and followed him around the side of the ship. I don't trust him, Dua said immediately, once they were out of earshot. What do we know about him? Wasting words be damned. This was important. There was a swarm in their midst. Vienna held up a calming hand. You haven't properly met him yet. You were out for a day longer than the rest of us. I believe him. He truly does want to help fight the Empire. Dua grunted. Look, Vienna said. Moroi found us unconscious in the ship. He could have killed us, captured us, or any number of other things. But he didn't. He stayed to help us. Now he's brought back food and he knows the lay of the land. We need him, even if you don't trust him. Does the ship work? Dua asked. The ship was able to fly. They could just lift off this planet and get back to the bandits as soon as possible. No, unfortunately, Vienna said, shaking her head. The warp jump inside the gravity well and the damage we took from the plasma shot fried the engines and ruptured most of the other systems. We're stuck here. Communications? Gone. The circuits were ruptured by the plasma shot, and what was left was ruined by Caucasus's body splattering into it. That was where the blood and body fragments had come from. An untethered, rotting corpse did not fare well in the crash landing. The only way to contact the rebellion would be if we snuck into the training camp Moroi mentioned. Seems like it would be only civilization on this planet, and they have the only ships. Dua thought for a moment. Clearly, the only way to get back to the rebellion was through the training camp. Simplest way to attack the camp, steal a ship, and fly out of here. But there was only 5 bandits against a large number of sworn. With Clint and Tedexia, they could have pulled it off, but with only Dua, Vienna, and 3 new bandits, none of whom had fought long as the bandits, it would be nearly impossible. We'll have to sneak in, using Moroi to gain access from the inside. Only way it'll work, he'll get us in and ensure that we get through out without running into anyone, Vienna said, finishing off Dua's train of thought. Dua looked at Vienna in shock. Had she been reading his mind? She chuckled. No, I haven't been reading your mind, Dua. It's the only logical way to do it. He sighed. It really was the best chance at success. He nodded reluctantly. I guess you're right. Where is the camp? Moroi said it's about 100 miles south of here, but he can't return until he retrieves something from the mountain, she said, pointing at the only landmark in sight, a mountain low in the northern horizon. What does the mountain have to do with it? Dua wondered aloud. He blinked when he realized what he had said. He never wondered aloud. His tattoo itched and he scratched it absently. I'm sure Moroi can explain that, Vienna said, nodding her head in the direction of the swarm who, with the other bandits, was in the middle of constructing a fire out of the wreckage pieces, presumably to cook the rias. Dua looked at her and then looked right back. You are going to have to work with him, like it or not. You might as well get used to talking with him. Dua snorted. I don't talk to most people. True, Vienna agreed, raising her brow. But you've been far more talkative these last few weeks than I've ever seen you. Dua shrugged as he turned his back and walked over to the fire. Boy had managed to get a pile of cloth and padding alight and was now in the process of maintaining the flame. Graal, Weiss, and the swarm each had a ryu in hand, having varying degrees of success getting it. Weiss was having the most trouble. Dua didn't think he had ever held a knife or carving before in his life. After watching another awkward silence, he gave up and struck out his hand. Give it here, Dua said. Weiss looked up in surprise, knife still embedded in the ryu. You're going to ruin the meat, Dua explained. Just give it here. No need to save words here. Preparing for dinner was a serious business, and deserved all the attention he could give it. Fire burned, meat tasted good, but only if it was prepared right. Reese looked down at the attempt and sighed, holding out the carcass wordlessly. Dewar sat, legs crossed, and took the Reus from Reese. Pulling out his knife, kept sharp as always, Dewar examined the Ryu, looking at for the best point to begin. Thankfully, Reese had not damaged it too badly, and most of the meat was still intact. Picking a point of entry, Dewar slipped the knife in the hind leg and made a smooth, clean cut through the skin. Slipping his knife inside, Dewar separated the skin from the meat, then made a single cut under the other leg. Finishing that, he set the knife aside and used his hands to pull the leg out of the skin. Then he struck the skin down on the leg and its haunches. Repeating the process on the other side, Dewar made a few more strategic cuts that shucked the skin the rest of the way, pulling it down the rest of the body and the head off. Were he saving the skin, Dewar would have done it more carefully, but the only concern was the meat here. Cutting open the abdomen, Dewar removed the organs and other non-meat items, and Ryu was surprisingly similar to the Swern of the Ithilia, where he first learned to hunt, enabling Dewar to clean it quickly. Picking up one of the metal rods collected for the splits, Dewar threaded the Ryu onto it and set it on the braces Poi had set up. Leaning back with a sigh, Dewar rested his hands on the stretched-out legs. He looked up to see that everyone had gone quiet, all looking at him. "What?" he asked, glancing around. He noticed that Kral and the Swarm were still in the process of skinning their Rias, and, while the Swarm was much farther along than Kral, neither of them would be done before the sun went down. Ree's mouth was hanging slightly open, his eyes wide. There was a pregnant pause. The Swarm held out his Ryu to Dewar. "Could you show me how to do that?" he asked, his tone sincere and curious. Dewar hesitated, thinking the Swarm was just being attentive to gain favor, then noticed a slight gleam in the Swarm's eyes. He really did want to learn. Perhaps he was not as bad as Dewar had thought. He would still need to keep an eye on him, though. Fire burned, meat tasted good, and Swarm bastards through and through. Reaching out a hand, Dewar took the Reus from Moroik. "Watch carefully," he said. Moroik leaned in close. The boiling water hissed at me, and I poured the grains from the bag to the pot. 2 similar pots already filled with grain, cooked to the side. I was making something called oatmeal that Clint had made before. It was a simple way to feed a large amount of people, provided that you had the materials. Since our most recent raid on the Swarm supplies, we had plenty. "I don't see how the stuff is supposed to taste good," Bo quipped next to me. I shrugged. "Throw in some sugar, a little bit of honey, and maybe a handful of raisins. Then the stuff tastes delicious." The makeshift kitchen in the base was a ramble-shot job. Natural grotto further hollowed out to fit the stoves and ovens. Water came from a series of pipes attached to the ceiling, along with the lights. All in all, it wasn't a bad place for a cave deep in the barren moon orbiting a dying star in a forgotten system. A dry storage was in the next room, and the coolers and freezers were in the room after that. Both were filled with bursting with foodstuffs and other edibles, which was a good thing because the bandits went through it at a prodigious rate. 45 soldiers in training ate pretty much everything they could get their hands on, 3 times a day. Since we didn't have a cook, there was a rotating schedule of who would prepare the meal's food. Today was Boar and I. Thankfully, it was breakfast, and I knew how to make oatmeal. I consider myself a fair cook, but I still like to make it simple. Boar, on the other hand, was considered a great cook by the rest of the bandits, along with Harris. And the bandits always took seconds and thirds from their meals. When Louth cooked, some people were either pretended to be ill or, if they did eat, ate only a single small helping. "Stir that pot, will you?" I asked Boar, pointing at one of the closest to him. He did so without complaining. I had found that with Clint gone, I really had no one to talk to, and so I had started to converse with whoever was near. All of the beings in the place, I found Boar was the easiest to talk with. He was the one of the oldest of the bandits, perhaps 40 years old, a good decade older than me. I was his commanding officer, but he had acted like we were 2 friends going out for business. "Any word from the captain or Dewar?" Boar asked casually. I knew that he was just concerned about them as I was. "Nothing," I said. "It's been a week," he said, the concern in his voice barely concealed. "I understand the captain taking longer, but Chua should have been back within a day. We need to look for them." I agreed with him, and I shouldn't have taken more than a day. They must have run into trouble along the way. Were Clint here, we could have mounted a search. But as it was, we didn't have enough ships to spare, and we only had the Black Beauty, and we couldn't leave a fair portion of the bandits here with no way off the moon. "I know," I said, "but we have no way of helping them. They will just have to fend for themselves." "If we had more ships," Ball started, "then we—" I raised a hand and quieted him. "But we have no way to get more ships, and—" I was interrupted by a loud voice over the intercoms, which we had installed recently to more easily communicate in the base. "Lieutenant, there are 2 ships approaching. They bear the rebellion insignia, and they have bring more recruits." This was Corquet's voice. He was one of the few bandits who seemed to enjoy working in the communications room, and so he was there at almost any given time. He never seemed to sleep either. I looked at Paul to find him already looking at me. "Watch the food," I said as I backpedaled out of the room and half walked, half ran to the hangar. As I walked, I contacted Harris through my wristcom. "Arm everyone who is awake and bring them down to the hangar. We have guests, friendlies, to be determined." I switched the comm off before I heard his reply, and contacted Louth. "Wake everyone who's not already awake, arm them, and bring them down to the hangar. Guests of unknown friendliness have arrived." "Will do, sir," came his reply, but I had already shut off the comm. I personally was heading for the first armory, conveniently placed close to the hangar for exactly this reason. The kitchens were the furthest point from the hangar, unluckily, and by the time I had arrived there were already a group of 20 bandits arming themselves under the directions of Harris. "Have you got anything on them?" I asked Harris as I quickly forced myself into the IPDM suit. I had become quite good at it over the last few months, mainly due to the endless drills Clint forced us to run. My fur gave me a bit of trouble, but I quickly smoothed it out. "Nay, the identities of the strangers remained cloaked in shadow. Nary a word hath been traded amongst the sites, and—" "They know would have been fine, Harris." A frown appeared on the Finrar's scaled face. "I was merely trying to shed light upon the situation. Methinks this best to have too many facts than not enough." I waved my hand in irritation. "It's fine, Harris. Get the men into position." There were women amongst the ranks, but commanders had called their soldiers men, regardless of gender, for tens of thousands of years, and they would until the end of time. I did the same. Harris called out in that strange speech of his, and the bandits advanced into the hangar, taking positions around the perimeter of the large space. Strategically placed crates, barrels, and other barriers provided cover for the defenders and obstacles for the attackers. As I followed them out, I heard the footsteps behind me. I glanced backwards to see Louth, the head of the rest of the bandits, leading them into the armory. Some of them seemed to be sleeping on their feet. I trusted Louth would get them in order. Taking to see Harris's men in place, I contacted Corquet. "Tell the ships they are free to land. No sudden movements." After several minutes, a hum filled the air as the ships approached. 2 ships appeared in front of the hangar opening, each big enough to carry 50 soldiers. Maneuvering carefully through the opening, the closest ship touched down 10 feet away from me. The second followed suit, touching down behind it. I stood before the barriers and crates, out in the open. I imagined I looked something like Clint out there, standing alone against an unknown odds. I felt someone step up beside me, and I saw Ball standing with a rifle held in a relaxed grip. "What are you doing here?" I hissed out of the corner of my mouth. "Backing you up," he hissed back. "You can't just walk in by yourself." I half turned to tell him off, but then the ramp and the ship began to lower. At that point, I was forced to cut my rebuke short. The ram sent down in a clang of metal on stone, and I saw unfamiliar figures gathered at the top, silhouetted by the lights of the carrier bay. I heard hands tightening on grips around the hangar, and I shifted my stance. making it easier for me to dive out of the way of any attack. The crowd at the top of the ramp shuffled in and split in the middle, allowing for a single large figure to walk down the ramp. Massive, covered in muscles, and possessing a gait of a being who was the most dangerous one in the room, and knew it. It was the walk of Clint Stone, but it was not him. It was Croort. The large squirm marched down the ramp, his arms held wide. Is this how the bandits greet friends? I'd hate to see how they greet enemies. I smiled before I knew what I was doing. I waved my hands in a downward motion. Put your guns down, these are friends. Walking forward, I met Croort at the bottom of the ramp. I clasped my hand in his in a gesture of greeting. I apologized for the rude welcome, but Command didn't tell us they were sending you. It's good to see you, Croort. His smile turned into a slight grimace. It seems they don't tell anyone anything these days. I brought you 100 new recruits to join your unit. 100 more will follow in a few weeks. I stared at him. 100 more? We don't have the infrastructure or the supplies or space. Why are they sending them here? Croort glanced around and said, Perhaps it would be best if we spoke in private. After leaving the orders to find quarters for the new recruits and unload the supplies, Croort and I found ourselves in the captain's quarters, seated around a table looted from the swarm outpost. It was a fine piece of craftsmanship, seamless and solid, yet still possessing utilitarian beauty. We sat opposite each other, he leaning on the back of his chair, leg resting on the other side, and I seated more rigidly, feet on the floor and hands on the table. So, I ventured, why are there 100 more soldiers arriving in a week? Croort leaned forward and looked me in the eye. It's starting. I raised my eyebrows in confusion. What's starting? The war! Within 6 months we will declare war on the Empire and attack it outright. I whistled and leaned back in my chair. War! What we had been doing here for the last few months was aggressive for sure, with mounds of corpses and smoking ruins left in our wake. But war was something different entirely. Battles over planets, systems, quadrants, vast armies clashing on the ground, in the sky, in the great black void. Fleets moving amongst the black void, seeking their counterparts' destruction, armed with terrible power. Soldiers met in blood and death, writhing, clawing and killing. Cities besieged, conquered, destroyed. Planets aflame, worlds wrought sterile and ruined before the might of empires. That was what Croort told of. We have the strength, I asked. The reason no one had ever won against the Empire was because the Squirm outnumbered, outgunned, and outfought any opponent. The independent systems joined. Croort inclined his head. A good portion of them did, all told. We have upward of 100 million soldiers, with more promised. We have several fleets, and we have a free fleet with us. That amounts to 10 regular fleets. I won't get into logistics, but our supplies are well stocked. He sounded very pleased. I was not. But the Swarm armies number in the tens of hundreds of millions, 50-some fleets and near limitless resources. We are more outnumbered than Cantamar was. How do they expect us to win the war? Croort sighed. With strategy, guts, and ferocity. The fact of the matter is that the last chance of the galaxy has. The Swarm gobbled up more systems every day. Millions of free beings are captured and enslaved. Rebellions extinguished with extreme prejudice. We are the last bastion against the darkness, and the last light of freedom in the sea of slavery and terror. We've gathered all we could, trained and prepared them, and now we are going to go to war. That is what the Council of Six has decided, and that is what we are going to do. I put my head to the side. This did not look good, but what could you do in the face of overwhelming odds other than stand against them and fight till the end? That still doesn't explain why you are bringing 200 new fighters here. We need you to train them. The bandits are, quite honestly, the best unit we've got. You started with next to nothing, and now you've built the space. He motioned with his hands, and you've performed dozens of missions without losing a single member. I brought them here to be trained by you and the bandits. The ones who make it through the training will be scattered amongst the various armies, and they will train more. Plus, he said, leaning forward, we'll leave a good portion of them here with you. We need to have a unit that can take any challenge thrown at them. We need an army of Clint Stones and TEDx Jakus if we are going to win this war. The Swarm have the Breakers and the Guard. We have the Bandits. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. The Breakers and the Guard were considered the best fighters in the galaxy, responsible for quelling rebellions and defending the Emperor, respectively. Croort himself had been from the Guard, and he was one of the best fighters I'd ever seen. That was a lot of pressure on the Bandits. What if we couldn't live up to their expectations? You'll have Clint to help you out, of course. He should be arriving the next week or so. His trial is underway as we speak. My head snapped up in the mention of Clint. He's in trial already. I thought that would take much longer than a week. Croort shrugged. I guess they want him out of there and back into the field as soon as possible. I shook my head. Clint always did manage to get out of situations that would have spelled disaster for any other being. Are you staying here then? If we're making the best unit in the rebellion, you would be a great asset. No, Croort said. They need me back at base to make sure the new ones know which end of the gun is which. Croort held up a thick finger. You are going to need more ships. Susan and that monstrosity in the hangar are not going to be enough for all of you. I know, I said. The thought had been floating around in my head for a while. Ever since Jua and Vienna had not come back, and we didn't have enough ships to find them. I've been thinking about that. The question is, where are we going to get them? I assume the rebellion needs all the ships it has right now. That, and more, Croort growled. Transportation is the key to a successful war effort. Supplies, troops, all need to get where they need to going quickly. We barely have enough ships to do it. I shook my head in acceptance. I assumed as much. We'll just have to use our ships wherever we can. Shrugging, Croort said, You could always steal one, he chuckled. I sat up straighter. He looked at me, head tilted slightly. You can't be serious, he said, voice disbelieving. I nodded. Hell, yes, I'm serious. It solves most of my problems. We need ships, so we steal them. I need to train these new bandits. It gives me a mission. We need to hurt the Swarm. Taking their ships solves that. I smiled. Thank you, Croort. That was most helpful. He sighed. You're crazy. Where are you going to get ships anyway? Swarm shipyards are heavily guarded, and the rest are in a massive fleets. Plus, you've only got one ship right now. There isn't much you can do with that. I thought for a moment. We'll take them from the bases and training camps. They'll have a few, and then we'll have enough. We'll start on the larger targets. I nodded, feeling better and better about this plan the more I thought about it. It solved a good deal of problems and gave me something to do. How long are you here for? They need me back the day after next to continue training the new recruits. Perfect. We'll be back tomorrow. I stood pushing my chair back, and Croort looked up at me, vaguely shocked look on his face. Where are we going? He asked. To find us a camp, I said emphatically. Time, 1 week ahead of TEDx's storyline. Jane, weighted by Susan, the crate underneath her provided good support for her tired legs, and she rested gratefully. She had stood for 6 hours in the judgment chamber, defending Clint Stone from the accusations of murder. It had been a grueling affair. She had never had to act as a lawyer before, and in the event had been quite taxing. But she had gotten him out. She had not only managed to get Clint declared innocent, but this incident would never go on record. Jane suspected that the judge had not been nearly as harsh as she could have been, but it was all still a huge feat to get everything dismissed. There had not been time to celebrate afterwards, as the general had requested Clint's presence the moment the trial had concluded. As so, Jane sat on a crate, waiting for Clint to return to Susan. She wiped her sweaty palms on her legs and noticed that there was not actually sweating. They just felt that way. Strange. She rarely sweated, but it was to be expected, she supposed. The upcoming conversation was not going to be pleasant. Her stomach fluttered again, and she hammered it down, drawing herself deeply into hard face. The lack of emotion was going to be needed here. She turned her thoughts over and over in her head, crafting a speech for Clint. It's not you, it's me, it's not the right time. There are outside circumstances. She considered each thought before tossing it aside. None could properly summarize what she wanted to say. It was not like she wanted to separate from Clint, but she knew that it was necessary. She had seen it during the trial. Clint spoke so passionately about the war, his war against the swarm. He could not afford distractions from that. He needed to focus all of his attention on defeating the swarm, on winning the war. And Jane could not afford distractions herself. She needed to be at her sharpest, at her most ruthless. Diplomacy during war was harsh. She needed every edge that she could get. She inhaled. This was necessary. It had to be done for the greater good. I was worried I would have to go searching for you through the base. She looked up to see the bright face of Clint Stone, hard face split by a broad grin. At the sight of that face so full of love for her, Jane nearly decided that the greater good was not nearly as important as her and their good. But her mind prevailed over her heart. Sometimes she hated that. Clint reached her crate and lifted a hand to touch her face. The living metal was warm against the skin, pushing firmly but gently on her cheek. Clint was always careful with his strength, raising her own hand as she grasped his, feeling the taut metal muscles shifting under her fingers. Swallowing hard, Jane drew a breath. Clint's eye, sharp as always, narrowed slightly at her demeanor. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern lacing his words. The words were hard to form, but Jane forced them out. "We have to stop seeing each other." The emotions that flickered across Clint's face were too numerous to count, but among them was anger, confusion, and sorrow. Confusion won out. But why? The hurt in his voice was almost too much for Jane to take, but she pushed through it. "We have to. It's best that—" Clint narrowed his eyes dangerously. "Was it your father?" he asked harshly. "I swear I'll—" Laying a calming hand on Clint's arm, Jane shook her head. "No, it was not my father. It's me." "But why?" he repeated, his face unreadable. "I know it's hard to realize it, but we have a duty, and that is far more important than the two of us." Jane shook her head, looking sadly at Clint. "You have your battles to fight, and I have my treaties and diplomacies to negotiate. We cannot afford distractions. You and I, we are each other's biggest distractions. We cannot afford to be together." You're saying that we can't be together because we need to focus on the war." With each word, Clint's eyebrows drew closer together, until they formed a solid line. Jane nodded. "Yes," she said, relieved that he understood. "That is exactly what I'm saying." He stood there, speechless, for a long moment. "That," he said, drawing the word out as if speaking to someone slow in the mind, "is the stupidest reason anyone has ever broken up with me." Jane recoiled slightly at the words. "Clint, don't you see? We have each other's parts to play, and our parts do not mix. We cannot force this to be when it cannot. I still love you. It is that you're thinking about. Of course, I still love you. It tears me apart to tell you this, but we cannot be together right now." A muffled thud came from the side as Clint's head snapped to the right, searching for a cause of the noise. A lone crew worker grimaced at the dropped tool before catching Clint's eye. The worker paled and hurriedly left the vicinity. He inhaled, his chest expanding until Jane thought he would burst. Letting out the air slowly, he said, in a deep, rocky voice, "I do not see how our relationship would affect our roles in the coming war. We would see each other rarely, and we managed fine these last few months." Jane shook her head. This was the trouble with interspecies relationships. There were certain cultural and physical differences that could not be overcome without a good deal of time, patience, and time, neither of which they had right now. but Tuni were a species of a single mind. They could not devote themselves to more than a single task, and the exact perform excellently at it. Humans, she surmised, were multitaskers, or, she thought somberly, Clint was a multitasker. It amounted to the same thing. I cannot do what I need to do if I'm thinking of you, Clintstone, and what I need to do is far more important than the two of us. Clint shook his head bitterly. He spoke, biting his words. There is nothing more important than us. We, and those like us, are the reason the rebellion fights, to protect those we love, and you would throw that away. Jane wanted to hit him. Was he being deliberately obtuse? But I would not stop loving you. I just cannot be with you. After this war is over, then we can return to each other, but I cannot focus on both you and my duty. Clint threw his hands in the air, half roaring with frustration. Fine! We shall separate for the duration of the war. He leaned in close, his eyes staring intensely into hers. But when this war is over, I intend to find you and make you mine. She gave him a fleeting kiss, brushing her lips against his. I expect nothing less. He shook his head and left, muttering something about crazy aliens and their crazy ideas. It sounded like him. She watched as Clint got into his ship and climbed into the air, before departing the hangar. He would be all right, she thought. He was Clint Stone. He always was. Now, time for diplomacy. Time, 1 week behind TEDx's storyline. And that's when the ship landed in front of me, finished Moroi as he sat across from Jua and the other rebels filling the space around the circle. The sun had fallen below the horizon, leaving the waste shrouded in darkness, save for a faint lines like the stars of pool light cast by the fire. When Vienna had asked him to tell Jua the story of how he ended up in the wastes, from the moment he forced enlistment to Cruel tossing him out to die, which Moroi had told the other rebels before Jua had woken up, he had obliged, thinking it was best to get Jua on his side as soon as possible. The rest of the rebels had little difficulty accepting him amongst their ranks, for which Moroi was grateful, but Jua seemed hostile from the start. Moroi did not blame him. Jua seemed to have much more history with the Swarm Empire than the rest of the rebels. Nudging Jua with her elbow, Vienna said, You see why I trusted him. He's just like us. The Empire tore apart his family, practically enslaved him, and tried to kill him. He's got every reason to help bringing them down. Jua grunted in reply. Moroi could not figure him out. The Guan was clearly the best fighter here, and seemed to be the leader. Yet Vienna seemed to assume equal amounts of leadership, and he rarely spoke, resorting to silent gestures and grunts to convey his thoughts, except when speaking with Vienna, or when he was instructing the other rebels in various tasks. Moroi had decided it would be best to wait and gather more information on Jua before making any judgments. Jua seemed to be a being with many layers, some buried so deep that even he didn't know that they were there. His physical appearance was also interesting, well-muscled and fit for a Guan. Jua wore a strange form-fitting suit made of material that seemed to change appearance on a whim. Underneath, Moroi could see that he wore the same white suit as the rest of the rebels, but it would seem that Jua cared for a strange suit more. On his wrists, Moroi could see the thick scars, the kind left by chains. That could explain Jua's deep hatred for the Swarm, having been a slave, but Moroi could tell it went deeper. How deep he did not know, and that tattoo on his cheek was a singularly interesting design, swirling fire surrounded by a twisting sword. A strange design, but one Moroi thought he knew. It was just buried in the far edges of his mind, hiding just behind the... Are you done? Jua's clicking voice shocked Moroi out of his trance and alerting him to the fact that he had been staring at Jua for the last minute. Stammered Moroi. What should he do? The problem was solved for him by Vienna, her bright voice filling the air. He's just curious, Jua. He was told us about himself, but he knows next to nothing about us. If we are going to be fighting on the same side, perhaps it is best to get to know each other. She glanced around the circle, Boy, Weiss, and Krull's intrigued faces, illuminated by the burning padding, all glanced at Jua. His stony face stared back at them in return, so Jua was as much of a mystery to them as they were to Moroi. That was interesting. "I'll start," Vienna continued, shifting her body so that she was fully facing Moroi. She said, "My name is Vienna Aureus. Once a citizen of Theodine Minor, and now a member of the rebellion against the Swarm Empire. I joined the rebellion after an incident with the Swarm army." Moroi could detect a slight catch in her voice as she said that, and assumed that she had lost someone close to her to the Swarm. A story all too common amongst the people of the galaxy. "I've been with the rebellion for 3 years now, and I've become a bandit, so that I could finally make a difference." Poi, Krull, and Weiss all shared their stories. Every one of them had been hurt by the Empire in some way, resulting in their decision to join the rebellion. As it turned out, Poi, Weiss, and Krull had all been members of the same unit for the last 2 years, and they had just recently joined the bandits, of whom Jua and Vienna were the original members. Moroi could see the rest of the rebels interested in the stories, and each contributed to them, asking questions to the others about things that they hadn't known. This continued for a good while, with Moroi learning a great deal about the people that he had rescued and who he had hoped would rescue him. Except for Jua, of course. He rarely showed emotion or did more than was necessary. Moroi was confused on one thing, though. "Who are the bandits? I thought you were rebels." Vienna opened her mouth to say something, but glanced at Jua, seemingly asking if she could answer. Jua remained motionless for a moment before nodding. "The bandits are a unit," Vienna explained. "We're kind of like a special forces of the rebellion." "One of," Weiss interjected. Jua hissed, glaring at him. Evidently, Moroi was not supposed to hear that. "Relax, Jua," Vienna said. "It's not as if the Swarm don't know we exist, and we can trust Moroi." Jua sighed a clear expression of disagreement. Moroi knew that Jua didn't trust him, and he accepted that. He was just going to have to prove that he was worthy of trust. "So, what is your plan for getting off this planet?" Moroi asked. Without glancing at Jua this time, Vienna answered, "We need your help for that. We need you to return to the Swarm base, and then find a way to get us in. Leave a door unlocked or something. After that, we'll steal a ship and fly out of here." Moroi blinked. Surely they had a better plan than that. When he noticed that they were all staring at him, Moroi realized that he had said it out loud. Jua spoke, for the first time in an hour. "No. This is simple, therefore having less chance of something going wrong. You want to prove your trustworthiness. Get us to the ships and we'll take you with us. Betray us, and I promise the last thing I will do will be to rip out your heart and shove it down your throat." He seemed to loom over the fire, a massive hulk made impossible by his smaller frame. But his intensity filled the air, casting a feeling of immensity behind him, hiding just outside of the range of the light cast by the fire. Moroi did not doubt that Jua meant every word that he said. "All right then," Moroi said. "I'll help, but there is a condition." The air grew cold and brittle despite the heat of the fire. Jua and Krull had eyes as steel, and the rest of the rebels were not much better. "What might the condition be?" asked Vienna, her voice much cooler than it had been previously. Moroi held up his hands, trying to appease them. He was treading in dangerous territory, judging by the reactions. "Please let me explain," he said. "It has to do with the reason I'm out here. I am not a good fighter. I'm weak, untrained, and frankly a bit of a coward. My drill instructor hates me for what I am, and he threw me out into the wastes, expecting it to kill me. I can only come back if I prove myself. In order to do that, I need you, real fighters who have seen combat, to train me. If you train me, I can get in without difficulty, and then I can get you in. You get in, we get off this planet." The rebels all looked at Jua, quietly staring into the fire. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Jua looked up. "Very well," he said. "We will train you." The warm, thick air of the pan filled Paul's lungs as he inhaled deeply. The heavy clouds did not help the cool air any. Instead, trapping the air under their weight, stagnant and stale, it wrapped around the world like something of a blanket. Boar loved it. His race, the Horizon, were developed on a world much like this one. TEDx was not having the same experience as Boar. Boar could hear him muttering under his breath, bemoaning the heat and the humidity, but he never said it out loud enough to be heard by anyone else, trying to set an example for the rest of the men. Angrily swatting at a branch out of his face, TEDx grumbled, "Stupid trees." Boar had never seen him so irritable. Heat really did not agree with him. After watching TEDx brush his fur aside for the 4th time, Boar concluded that it was TEDx's fur causing most of the discomfort. The humidity had caused it to cool in places, and it seemed to retain a good deal of moisture. The bandits crept up the hill, a group of 50 stealthily approaching a swarm training camp. They had landed some 20 miles away to hide the ships from detection. They had flown in extremely low to avoid the air sensors, and then proceeded on foot when they had reached the edge of the proximity grid. Topping the hill, a valley spread out before Boar, filled with trees and other vegetation, except for the large swath of cut in the swarm base. The view was nothing but green as far as the eye could see. TEDx stepped behind him. "I see the swarm were not kind enough to leave us a path," he said, nodding to the wide clearing. Boar shrugged, his suit pulling in his shoulders as he did so. "I'd have done the same. See any good ways in?" Boar's eyes were not the best at great distances, so he left that up to TEDx, who was one of the furthest sighted of the bandits. TEDx squinted, cupping his hand around his eye to block out the distractions. "It seems to be just flat plain and 500 yards around the perimeter." "No cover? Nothing?" TEDx shook his head. "Not that I can see. So it's a sprint to the outskirts. I see no walls, so yes. Dead sprint and hope that they don't notice us before we're on top of them." TEDx scratched his chin. "I wish we had Dewar here. He'd just sneak up nice and close, clear a path for us." "Or Clint," Boar mused. "He'd just blast his way across the field and mop up any survivors when we got to the other side." "You're right about that," TEDx gave a half smile. "Fortunately for us, we've got Croort. He amounts to much the same." Boar glanced across the clearing to where Croort would be gathering his men, too far to actually see. Altogether, there were 100 bandits here, split into squads of about 16, led by TEDx, Croort, Louth, Harris, Croquet, or Boar. Boar could hear the rest of the bandits gathering behind him and TEDx, some panting from the exertion. They would adjust. "I want you to lead your squad through this mess hall there." TEDx pointed at a long, low building. "Clear that and get to the airfield to support me." Turning to Harris, who had quietly joined them at the summit, TEDx motioned to the communications tower. "I want you to silence this race. No one learns about this until we let them know." "This I can do." Harris scowled, his face split into a savage smile. "Good," TEDx nodded. "Your squad will lead the charge, and we," he gestured to Boar and himself, "will provide cover fire. Once we hit the boundary, get to your objectives." Glancing over to the collected troops, TEDx nodded. "Good luck." Boar and Harris echoed him and then led their squads in separate ways, gathering at the edge of the forest. Opposite the mess hall, Boar and his men paused before the assault. Glancing around him, Boar noted the names and faces one more time. Not a single one would fall, he would make sure of that. A single shot flashed across the clearing, signaling the beginning of the assault. Harris and his squad burst from cover and began the long sprint to cover. Lifting his gun, Boar followed suit, sprinting across the clearing as fast as he could. 500 yards of open, coverless glass. There was no guard towers or walls, but covering 500 yards still presented the enemy with ample time to kill you, providing that they knew that you were coming. The bandits had gone to great lengths to ensure that they did not. 400. He spotted movement at the edge of the mess hall and opened fire. Dropping a swarm recruit, the noise seemed to alert more, and they spilled out of the surrounding buildings like ants from an upturned hill. The cries of alarm reached him. 300. Plasma filled the air around him, and his squad opened fire on the swarm. They dropped like flies. They were recruits fresh from their home planets, unprepared for combat. 200. Some feeble, solitary plasma shots responded, but those swarm with weapons were cut down quickly. The odd shot did manage to hit Ball's team was absorbed by the IPDM suits. Of all the things Glintstone had done, creating the IPDM was perhaps the greatest. It certainly had been the most impact. Now, one soldier could face 20 to survive. A point-blank shot from the chest was nothing more than a warm touch. 100. He could see the swarm scurrying around in orderly chaos. They were disciplined, Ball had to admit. Still, disciplined or not, they were undertrained and had yet to go adequate response to the bandits' attack. 50. He could begin to see the faces of the swarm as they grew closer. See their eyes widen with surprise and fear as white-clothed fighters closed in on them. Unleashing fire from their weapons, he could see the swarm recruits, fresh from whatever planet they called home. Realizing what it felt to be under attack from superior forces, what it felt like to live in a galaxy where the Empire decided who lived and who died. 0. He crushed that fear from their eyes, left them dead, and with the last thought in their minds. With minutes, their mess hall was cleared and Ball was on the way to the airfield. A distant explosion signaled the destruction of the communications tower. Harris may be a little crazy, but he got the job done. Ball moved on. Any swarm seen were cut down. The recruits offered no resistance, other than a few shots that missed or were deflected by the IPMD suits. Most weren't even armed, the weapons apparently stored in the armory until training. No one had expected an attack here, and so there were no defenses in place. The trained soldiers gave admirable resistance when they could, yet they were as grain before a scythe. Ball personally killed 4 when his team arrived at the airfield. TEDx and his squad had already cleared it and were in the process of warming up the engines. Gesturing to half of his men, Ball said, "You wait, watch for attackers from the north. You, the other half, you watch from the east." Approaching TEDx, Ball lifted his hand in an informal salute. "I think we did well, Lieutenant. Not a casualty on our side, and from the sounds of it, Crewart is mopping up on the other side nicely." Murmured TEDx. He seemed to be distracted, his eyes gazing into the distance. Ball tried to follow his gaze, but saw nothing. "Sir?" Ball asked. It was nothing urgent, otherwise TEDx would have said something, but this was out of character for the Jahan. "What?" TEDx asked, coming back to himself. "No, it's nothing." TEDx turned to the bandits working on the swarm scout ships and troop transports. "Let's get those ships running and get out of here." "Aye, sir," they chorused. The sound of plasma erupted from the south, and Ball spun around, half-stepping towards the Noi before TEDx caught his arm. "Crewart has it under control." Within a few moments the noises faded. Whether that meant Crewart had won or not, Ball did not know. A fighter came from behind the building. He was wearing a distinctive IPDM suit of the Rebellion. The Rebellion had won. Crewart was shortly after, along with the rest of his squad. When he had reached earshot, TEDx called out, "Any difficulties?" "None," came the reply. "You wrap this one up nice and tight. You make a damn fine leader." "Not bad for a Jahan, huh?" "TEDx, you're so far from a Jahan, it's like you're a different species." Both TEDx and Crewart laughed at that. "Ships are ready, Lieutenant," called the Merok, whose bulk strained against the IPDM suit. "All right, let's get out of here." We gained 7 ships that day, 5 scout ships and 2 transports. Of course, there was still work to be done on them, as they were swerve vessels, but we now had sufficient number of ships to move around with comfort. The new recruits adjusted nicely to the life in the bandits, quickly adopting our ways. I had very few problems with them. Crewart had picked them well. 4 days later, Clint returned. He strode out of Susan, smiling that big white grin of his. "It seems you've done well in my absence." I shrugged. "No better than can be expected. I hear you got off penalty-free from your trial." Clint's face grew somber. "Not entirely," he said. "Well, I'm not in trouble for killing Karok. There are other matters which are punishment enough." His voice was dark and low. Something bad had happened. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeding the response. "Jane and I are no longer seeing each other." I blinked. Of all the things I thought I might have happened, that was not one of them. "You mean you broke it off with her?" "We've separated. It was her idea," Clint growled. "She said that this was not going to work. She had her duties and the rebellion, and I have mine." Shaking my head in confusion, I said, "But that doesn't make any sense. I thought you two were madly in love. Last time I saw you two together, you couldn't keep yourselves to yourselves." Clint shrugged, a shallow, defeated shrug. "I don't understand it either." "Captain, you're back!" The rest of the bandits surrounded us before Clint and I could talk further. Smiling and clapping the soldiers, Clint did not appear to be tormented by his thoughts and was the picture of good cheer. But I knew better. This would grow worse in the future. "Captain, it's good to see you again," Louth said, the distinctive voice cutting across the chatter. "There are a number of things of import to discuss." Clint's hand waved dismissively. Of course, but later. For now, I have something to say." The hangar grew quiet. It was an odd quiet. The old bandits knew and respected Clint, and so their silence was respectful. The first wave of recruits had been on one mission with Clint, and he had killed their previous commander. Their silence was one of fear and apprehension. The second wave of recruits had never met Clint, and only knew him through the stories and rumor. Their silence was one of pure awe. "I see you have grown since the last time here. This is good. I see you have captured more ships from the swarm. That is good. You've started something that I intend to see grow into a great thing. From the single base, from these few ships, from these few soldiers, I intend to build a fleet, an army. We shall become a scourge, a plague upon the swarm. With this army, we shall burn the Empire to the ground." The passion of his voice filled the air and the ears of the bandits. A cheer erupted in the back of the 150 men, sweeping to the front. A wordless shout filled the hangar, carved in the rock and reverberated through the tunnels. We were going to war with the swarm, and we damn well intended to win. End of chapter. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider subscribing. If you wish to support the author, there is a link to the original story, so pop over there and give him your support. If you wish to support this channel, however, there are a few ways to do so. The best and easiest would be to share this video with other people, as well as liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. All of these things tell the algorithm that this channel is at least vaguely interesting, and that may share it with other people. If you wish to support the channel in some other manner, watching my other videos would also help tremendously. Or, if you really like, there is a link down below to leave a tip or to join the Patreon. Any and all support is very much appreciated. And I hope that you all have a good one until the next time, and I'll see you then. Cheers.